Okay, Joash was the last surviving heir of King David. When only a newborn, his life was spared by his aunt and his uncle, who themselves took on a great risk in saving the life of this young child. For a while, Joash was a faithful servant of God. For a while, he was a good, faithful king. But what we're going to find is that something would happen in his life that would cause him to betray the very ones who had saved his life. King Joash, in some of the recorded locations that we find his name mentioned, his name sometimes is Jehoash. To me, it's easier to say Joash, so that's the name that I'm going to use. But just know that sometimes you'll see both of those names used in reference to this one man. But I would say that Joash is one of the more tragic characters that we read about in the Bible. Because here was a man who really had everything going for him. He had a good upbringing. He was raised by godly people. He had good advisors. This was someone that, for all intents and purposes, he should have been successful. He should have been faithful to God. But we find that his life ended up becoming very tragic because of decisions that he made. Well, you may remember from a previous study, Joash, he became king when he was only 7 years old. We talked about the fact that we don't know why the age of 7 was the age when it was selected for him to come out of hiding and become king. There's some different speculations out there, but there's no way to know for certain why that age was chosen. But after he was crowned at 7 years old, he would go on to reign over Judah for a period of 40 years. His father was Ahaziah, and his mother was a woman by the name of Zebiah. And Zebiah was originally from the region of Beersheba. But as we read in 2 Kings 22, 10 through 12, he was not raised by his parents. He was raised by his aunt, a woman by the name of Jehoshabeth, and her husband Jehoiada, who was a priest of God. They protected Joash from being murdered, listen to this, by his own grandmother. Athaliah was trying to kill every other person who had a claim to the throne. If she had known about Joash, this little newborn baby, if she had found out that he was alive, then his life would have been taken. Well, we find that as long as his uncle Jehoiada was alive, Joash did what was right in the sight of God. Jehoiada became the godly father figure that this young man needed, but also he became a strong, faithful advisor for this young man. We find that he was even the one who stepped in and served in the father's role of being the one who arranged the marriage of Joash. In those days, it would be the king who would select who his heir was going to marry. Well, his father was dead. And so his uncle steps in. And he's the one that makes that selection we see in 2 Chronicles 24, 2 and 3. But we find that during the reign of Joash, there were some people who continued to worship false gods. You may remember that Jehoiada had gone in right after this 7-year-old had been named king. Jehoiada went in and had driven idol worship out of the land. But we find that there were some who went into the high places and began to worship idols once again. They began to offer sacrifices. They began to burn incense in those locations. And we'll take note a little bit later in the lesson about how that came about and what happened as a result of it. But as we've noted, Joash was anointed king at 7 years of age. Prior to that, he remained hidden in the temple. He grew up in the temple, in the priest's quarters. There he was hidden for 7 years. But when Joash was 7 years old, his uncle went out and made a covenant with the captains of the military. And one source that I looked at said that these captains of the military essentially were the bodyguards of the monarchs. These were the ones who would have the charge of protecting the king. And so Jehoiada goes out, he converses with these men, then he reveals the fact that there is an heir of David that is still living. There is someone who is the rightful heir to the throne. And that was Joash. And we find that at that time, according to 2 Kings 11 and verse 4, those troops were divided up into different companies. They were placed in different areas around the temple. They were given charge to protect the king. They were not to allow anyone to enter into the temple who was not authorized to do so. So Joash is brought out, a crown is placed upon his head, he's anointed, a testimony is given, and this young man becomes the anointed king of Judah. And all of those who were there, they began to celebrate, they began to cry out. There was great celebration in that city. Well, his grandmother hears the commotion coming from the temple. This is where we kind of ended in our discussion of Athaliah. But she hears this commotion going on in the temple. She is not authorized to enter the temple. Well, she comes in, she busts into the temple, and there she sees this 7-year-old man, or 7-year-old child, with a crown on his head and people offering allegiance to him. And she begins to cry out treason. She felt like that they had turned against her, that this child was trying to take over her position, which she never rightfully had the authority to claim. Well, when this happened, Jehoiada spoke out, and he told those guards to take Athaliah out of the temple, to remove her from the temple grounds, and to put her to death. Well, ultimately this was because, and the way that this all was able to come about, is because of that proclamation he had made, that no one who was unauthorized was to enter into the temple. So this brought an end to the reign of Athaliah.
Do you think that this young man, this 7-year-old, do you think he was destined to be killed? Because if God was with him, and God had already forecast that there would be a descendant of David on the throne, that woman wouldn't go kill that child.
Well, this is the providence of God at work, because in her mind she was going to kill them all. In her intent,
I could see her doing it because God had said there was going to be that heir there.
Exactly.
It was the last of it.
Exactly. And the way that God fulfilled that was through this providential action that was taken of hiding this child and taking him in and caring for him. Well, 2 Kings 11 and verse 20 tells us that at the death of Athaliah there came to be peace in the nation because of the death of Athaliah. Well, then we're not told exactly how much time passes by. I'm sure that Joash was probably in his late teens, if not early 20s, at the time that this next action takes place. Because I believe that from the text, I think that it indicates to us that until he came of age, until he reached the point that he was able to fulfill those duties in a capable fashion, that his uncle was there advising him and guiding him through the decisions that needed to be made. But we find in 2 Chronicles 24, verses 3 and 4, that Joash determined that it was time for the temple to have some work done. During the reign of Athaliah, the temple had been ransacked. A lot of the instruments and things that would have been used there in the temple in carrying out their sacrifices and their rituals, a lot of those had been taken, had been desecrated because they were used in temples to false gods. And there was a lot of work that needed to be done to the temple. Well, there was a proclamation in the old law that was set forth in Exodus chapter 30, verses 12 through 16, that stated that a collection was to be taken up in perpetuity, that was to be there to provide for the maintenance of initially the tabernacle and then later the temple. Well, come to find out, as we see in 2 Chronicles 24 and verse 6, they hadn't been collecting this. The Levites and the priests, they had been going around, they had been collecting some funds, but they hadn't been doing exactly what they were supposed to do, and the funds they had collected had not been used as they were to have been used. And so as we see there in 2 Chronicles 24:6, we find that Joash, he calls Jehoiada to him, calls his uncle the priest, and he says, "Why have you not required the Levites to bring in from Judah and from Jerusalem the collection, according to the commandment of Moses, the servant of the Lord, and of the assembly of Israel, for the tabernacle of witness?" And so he asks his uncle, he says, you're the main priest. You're the one that's here at the temple. Why have you not been doing what the law says? Why have you not been sending the Levites out into these villages and collecting this contribution that is to go toward the upkeep of these structures? Well, simply put, they had let their guard down. They were more worried, at least by my estimation. If you disagree, please tell me. But I feel like for so long, they had been more concerned with sparing their life. Because we find during the reign of Ahab and his descendants, you remember all of the priests, the prophets, many of them had been put to death. The worship of God was heavily under attack in that nation. And I think a lot of things had simply fallen by the wayside. Well, Joash, at least at this point in his life, he's trying to do what's right. He's trying to get the temple brought back to its former glory. He's trying to get it to where it is more functional for its intended purpose. And so what takes place is the king makes a proclamation. And in this proclamation, he commands all of those in the kingdom of Judah to go back to paying their portion of this contribution. Well, it's very well received. The people in that kingdom, they don't balk against it. They support their king in this decision. And so what takes place, he has a large chest built. And this chest is set outside of the temple in Jerusalem. And as people would come to Jerusalem, that's where they would go. And this is what came in the first century to be referred to as the temple tax. And so what would take place, people would come, and initially it was just this one large chest that was there. And they would come, they would make their contributions, and it said the contributions were so much that it had to be emptied each and every day. Well, you remember over time, this came to be a source of contention among the Jews. This came to be an issue that Christ had. Because people were coming in not with the intention of giving a free will offering for the upkeep of the temple and the welfare of the priests. No, they were doing this as a sign of their wealth. They were coming in and giving large amounts of money and doing it in a very showy fashion. But we find that when this process, at least in that capacity, when it began, it was done in a proper fashion. And so as we read in 2 Chronicles 24, 12 through 13, that as those funds began to come in, workmen were employed to go through and to restore the house of God to its original condition and to reinforce it. But then we're also told that whatever funds were left over, it was taken, and some of those utensils that had been taken and desecrated, they were recrafted. And they were put back into service in their rightful place in the temple. And we're told that so long as Jehoiada was alive, things functioned as they should at the temple. Burnt offerings continued to be made as they were supposed to at the temple. But then a situation arose that would change the trajectory of Joash's reign. We find at the age of 130 years, Jehoiada grew old, was full of days, and he died. We're told that he was so well respected that when he died, he was buried along with the kings of Judah. More than likely, this was because of the wise counsel that he had given to Joash during those early years of his reign. But in the death of Jehoiada, Joash lost not only his father figure, he also lost his wisest advisor. And 2 Chronicles 24 and verse 18 tells us that what he does next is what's going to change the future of that nation for a while. It says that he began to listen to the leaders of Judah and allowed them to leave the house of the Lord God of their fathers and allowed them to resume serving wooden images and idols. So essentially what happened, the people started clamoring for something different. We don't want the old ways. We want to do something different. We don't want to have to come to Jerusalem. We want to be able to have an altar in a more convenient location. We want a more convenient religion. And Joash went along with their demands.
Like today, there's people, just clamoring for all kinds of religion, whatever will make it easy on me.
That's right. That's right. And they will find people that will go along with that. And that's what happened here. As long as Jehoiada was alive, they were faithful to God. They would not go against this man. And Joash would not go against him. But after he died, and that strong influence was not there, you look what happened. Folks, this is why it is so important in the Lord's church that those older, wise men take the time and the effort to instill in those upcoming generations the importance of remaining faithful to God. Because there will come a day when we won't have those older generations to turn to. There will come a day, folks, when we are the older generation. And some of you here tonight are in that position. But what we find is that Joash, he did not honor the legacy of that previous generation. He allowed idolatry to come back into that nation. Now, during this time, we find that God repeatedly was sending prophets, warning the people, don't do this, don't go back to idolatry, turn back to God. But time after time after time, the people rejected those prophets. But then we find that an incident took place that really was going to seal the deal on the legacy of Joash. For we find that God sent a prophet by the name of Zechariah. Zechariah, we're told, was the biological son of Jehoiada and Jehoshabeth, the aunt and uncle who had raised Joash. And quite possibly, these men had grown up together. God chose Zechariah to go to Judah and to prophesy. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 24 and verse 21, back up to 20. Zechariah, he comes and he says, "Thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he also has forsaken you." Well, the people of Judah didn't like what he had to say. They decided that this man needed to be silenced. And we read in the next verse, "And at the command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord." Now you stop and you think about just how far Joash has gone. He has now killed a prophet of God, a man who more than likely was like a brother to him, a man who was continuing in the legacy of his father figure, who had been his advisor for probably about 20, 25 years at least at this point. But I want you to notice in 2 Chronicles 24 and verse 22, as these stones are raining down upon Zechariah, he makes one last statement. It says, as Zechariah was dying, he said, "The Lord look on it and repay." Simply put, he said, folks, God sees what's happening and you will pay the price. You're not going to get away with this.
In verse 17, it's talking about after his uncle's death, princes came.
Do what now?
Princes came to Joash, I guess, and influenced him. In verse 17.
Yeah, the princes there, this would have been talking about the leaders of the tribes. That was a term that was more a political term in those days. And so this would have been those who were his advisors, those that he had turned to, as we read about earlier, where it talked about that he went to the leaders of those tribes, and those were the ones who were advising him. Well, he went along with what the people wanted. Do we remember another king that did that and it didn't turn out well? What about the very first king? What happened with King Saul when he was told to go and destroy all of the Amalekites? Why didn't he do it? Come on, folks. Why didn't he do it? Because the people didn't want him to. They wanted to bring spoils of battle back. They wanted to bring the king back with them so they could celebrate in his public execution. He fell out of God's favor because rather than going along with God, he went along with the people. The very same thing is now happening with Joash. Well, for just a moment, we're almost out of time. But you may remember in Matthew chapter 23, verses 34 through 36, Jesus is talking to the scribes and the Pharisees. And he talks about this repayment for Zechariah's blood. And he reveals to them that this was going to take place at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. This repayment for Zechariah's blood ultimately is God's rejection of that nation. It's not talking about specifically the nation of Judah that was in existence at that time. What this is talking about, it's talking about God ultimately rejecting them because they rejected Christ. And we know that this ultimately took place in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome. And from that point on, the Jews have never been allowed to reestablish themselves as a national entity ever again. Now you may wonder, well, what about the nation of Israel that's there today? Folks, that's completely different. This is talking about based upon a lineage, based upon a bloodline, only those who are a part of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Those were the ones that this is being prophesied about. Those are the ones that were destroyed in the destruction of Jerusalem. And that unit has never been able to establish itself in that national sense ever again. Why? And you've heard me say this before, and I think it's a very, very good comment, a very astute observation. For the guy in Woods, he made the statement that when the kingdom ultimately rejected Christ was when their high priest stood up before Pilate and said, "We have no king but Caesar." We don't accept Jesus as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We don't accept him as the Savior. We do not see him as the Messiah. Our allegiance is only to Caesar. Well, at that point, folks, they weren't going to have another opportunity. They weren't going to have another Messiah. And so at that point, that kingdom was doomed. All right, we're going to stop right there. Next week, we will make just a few concluding remarks on Joash, and then we will go into talking about some of these kings of Israel that only reigned for just a short period of time. Jehoahaz, and then, surprise, another man by the name of Joash. We see these names repeated quite often as we go through these sections. But that's where we'll pick up next Wednesday night.